2-1. Hey folks, Zach Osterman, Indianapolis Star, Mike Niziolek. I'm pointing at him through the screen if you're watching this on YouTube. Bloomington Herald Times. This is Mind Your Banners for December 15th, 2022. A lot of ground to cover today, a lot going on. Mike, I think there's obviously basketball to discuss, but I think we should start with football because we really haven't talked about that since Curt Cignetti's hiring, and a lot has happened. First of all, there was the predictable sort of wave of players off the roster, coaching change, into the portal, etc. And what we're starting to see now is a bit more of sort of the movement back toward the roster, either of freshmen, or I guess you call them high school, but will be freshmen committing to Indiana, or some transfers coming in, or some players pulling out of the portal. Needless to say, it is a very hectic time to be a head football coach in college.
Well, yeah, I mean, your roster turning over, I think Curt Cignetti said he anticipates about 30% every year. So, I mean, it's significant, and it's even more significant when there's a coaching change. But, I mean, to your point, not a lot of the players that were in the portal have come back, only two, and Carter Smith's really the only notable one, no offense to Jordan Greer. But 9 have committed elsewhere. I don't think that they're probably going to have too many others coming back, just based on kind of how things have kind of unfolded. So a lot of room to sort of make this roster. They only offered 4 players from James Madison that they had committed. So there's still going to be plenty of space to sort of try to piece this thing together.
I think some of the big we've talked about, at least in what we've written and on social media, some of the big names out include obviously Donovan McCulley, the 2 offensive linemen, Matt Bedford and Khalil Benson, who have since committed to Colorado. Lewis Morris going to Ole Miss. Who have they gotten back? Carter Smith was the big one. Jordan Greer gives them some safety depth, which they need because so many of their safeties are either done with their eligibility or moved on through the portal. McCulley is still floating out there. We'll kind of see where that goes. I think for a while, Indiana was hopeful. And then for a while, it seemed like everybody just sort of assumed, including me, that once the big hitters kind of got involved, it was unlikely he'd come back. I would say it feels like that has sort of equalized a little bit. And maybe there's a little bit more optimism than there was, but an acceptable dose of sort of realism of who you're competing against. The biggest name right now is probably Curtis Rourke, the quarterback from Ohio, who was MAC. Was he off? I think it's offensive and defensive player of the year. I don't think there's just like one player of the year in the MAC. At least that's my read of it. But he was MAC offensive player of the year in 2022. He tore his ACL. He managed to come back and contribute this year. And Ohio has put together back-to-back 9-win seasons. We had a sense that Cignetti and his staff were going to look for a transfer QB who maybe was only going to be around for 1 or 2 years, but could kind of be a bridge while they sort of settled their offense and developed some younger QBs. And that's very much what it feels like Rourke is going to be. Obviously, he's going to have to win the job. It goes without saying, but I think you'd make him the front runner at this point.
Yeah, I mean, and usually the handpicked guy is the guy that you're going to go with if you're the new coach. Obviously Taven Jackson's still here, Brock Lowry, but I think they'll have an uphill battle to climb. I didn't see who Rourke got offers from. I guess Vanderbilt, BYU, Wake Forest.
I think also Boise State was involved. So I mean, some programs kind of around your level, some that probably have slightly higher aspirations, but it's they didn't beat out Ohio State. On the other hand, their only competition wasn't other MAC schools or anything like that. It was just kind of somewhere in that vague in between.
Yeah, and I wonder how much his upside was limited with coming off the injury in terms of the ACL, trying to stay healthy. That probably docked his value a little bit in the transfer portal. There's a lot of quarterbacks. I think Cignetti's background gives you a little more faith that he's going to be a guy that can make the leap to the Power 5. But I'm always hesitant. I saw this kind of at Virginia Tech with they got Grant Wells, who was at Marshall, who had really good numbers, and then just struggled because the competition is it's just so much, it's just such a leap. And so I think if it wasn't for Curt Cignetti's prowess as a quarterback kind of evaluator and the staff that he has that has kind of developed quarterbacks, I'd be a little more hesitant to, I would say you go after another Power Five quarterback, to be honest. That's just kind of, I mean, didn't necessarily work out with Taven, but that's kind of, I think, a straighter path to success. But I mean, this is a rebuild. So they're not going, you're not trying to start a championship team here. You're trying to get to 6 wins.
And I do think, like, I mean, there's a couple things. One of the things that stood out to me, and I think people have kind of cottoned onto it a little bit more since his introductory press conference. I think it kind of sort of glossed over a little bit that day and has maybe come into greater focus since his kind of line about how he prefers, I don't remember the exact word, but how he prefers, was it like basically production over potential, that he's, there's an extent to which he's always going to value the guys that he feels like he just sees, like, the floor is high. Again, you talk about, obviously this is all going to come down to his and his staff's ability to evaluate not just talent, but what talent fits them. For example, it's been interesting to me that Indiana's really made no push for Jordan McLeod, who was obviously Sun Belt Conference Player of the Year with Cignetti at James Madison last season. At least publicly, there's been no real sort of, other than I think maybe some immediate interest and admittedly some assumptions on the part of people like me that McLeod might just follow him to IU. It didn't seem like Indiana ever really sort of prioritized McLeod the way that they prioritized Rourke, who took a visit this week, who, was kind of a name that was out there for a while. I don't think Cignetti's just going to take transfers, but it's interesting to me that it seems like his starting point, whether it's high school or the portal, at least in his own words, sort of seems to be like that he wants to be sure where the floor is with a guy first and foremost. And
Well, we'll see. I mean, it's only taken 2 transfers, so it's hard to say.
well,
And Justice,
but that was
Justice
his. I mean,
Ellison doesn't have that, is sort of a different. I mean, I think it's very different. His production has sort of been sort of very average. So it's like, I think it might be the quarterback. Obviously, I think production makes a difference. It'll be interesting to see what other kind of transfers they take. I mean, how aggressive they're going to be, because they have been kind of slow to move in terms of numbers wise. I mean, I know they have ground to make up, but I mean, they just have so many roster spots open right now. I mean, in a matter of a couple of weeks, we could be talking about, they probably need 15 transfers here.
no, that's fair. I mean, and I think again, like they have not really sort of, through back channels or anything like overly publicized visits. We've kind of had to pick up on a lot of the transfers just because they've sort of tweeted and posted on social media as they've rolled through town. And we'll see where Indiana gets up to with some of those. I think this weekend is going to be a big one. And I think the portal first window is what, the 20th through the 22nd, I think. Where does Indiana kind of wind up? What's up?
In terms of actual signing,
Yeah, for transfers, I think it's the 20th to the 22nd. Obviously, the high school signing window is also next week, so we'll kind of see where Indiana. I mean, since the portal opened, there's always been a handful of transfers. It feels like they kind of come out of nowhere in the 24 hours before, but then you find out that they visited 2 weeks ago and they were kind of on this like sprint through visiting 4 or 5 schools, and then they picked one. There is a lot to do, and again, I think we'll see how quickly he moves by basically where Indiana winds up in that window, that signing window. The bigger question I have is offensive line, and just Carter Smith is back, and there's some, I guess, some promising younger pieces on this roster, and Bob Bostad will know whether or not he likes maybe some of the guys that are now stepping in for your Khalil Bensons and your Matt Bedfords, and I think Zach Carpenter is still kind of floating out there. I don't think he's publicized a lot about whatever's been going on in his transfer recruitment. But I think that, even to the extent that I wonder if there might be more James Madison players that wind up in the portal after their bowl game, and that's a stretch. I mean, that's but he's already had some guys come with him. He brought a lot of his staff with him. And it wouldn't be shocking to see an 11-1 Sun Belt team, stocked with guys that maybe want to stay true through the bowl game. But then when this picks back up after Christmas, they wind up going in the portal to see what their options are. But it is going to be a fascinating build up to next week because, as you said, I mean, they need bodies, and they've obviously got to be comfortable with not just taking guys that are going to not have a lot of value at this level. Guys that are going to be overwhelmed or overmatched at this level, but they do just kind of need pieces at the moment too.
Well, I mean, you talk about the offensive line. I could maybe piece together a starting five. Defensive line, I mean, geez, they don't have much of anything right now. I mean, Marcus Burris, Philip Bleedy, and then a whole lot of not experienced, 7 total players on the defensive line. I know Tom Allen before he left was high on Tadarius Collins, but because if Max Longman were to come back, you got Noah Boltkoff. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. Austin Barrett, Carter Smith. I mean, there's some. I mean, you could kind of get there. They still need more bodies because they only have 8 or 9 offensive linemen with Carter Smith coming back. But defensive line, they can't even run it 2 deep right now, which is crazy. So, and I don't remember how many signees they have on the defensive line in their class either. So.
Well, they've had two of the kids they've added from the James Madison class. One was an edge rusher, and one was just kind of described as defensive line. Looking at his film a little bit and his frame, Mario Landino, it seemed like he might be more of an inside guy as he fills out than an outside guy, but I'm not completely. And the other thing is, I can't say I've watched enough of Curt Cignetti's defense to feel good about, well, this is what he wants. This is the scheme he runs.
Those were the only 2 commits right now on the defensive line. So that was it.
Okay.
They've got 3 offensive linemen. So still not a lot of help. I mean, because usually defensive linemen, it takes time. It's rare for, especially if you're recruiting sort of the lesser, 3-star, not lesser, but 3-star guys. Physically, it takes time. So yeah, I mean, I think both the lines are in massive need of some help, and I think they do need at some point some experience on the defensive line to sort of bolster that effort.
There are 1 or 2 guys, because they had 3 guys in the top 4 at James Madison in tackles for loss in the Sun Belt last year, and I think one of them may still have eligibility, maybe 2 of them. So again, I mean, the important thing to kind of remember is, the portal does pick back up a little bit after Christmas, and then basically like it's like what it's like you have this sort of like window for recruiting and signing between semesters essentially, and then everything kind of shuts down, at least in I can formally sign with another school, I'm leaving, here's where I'm going. It shuts down again to what, like the end of May or the middle of May. It's basically after spring practice. Like you get that
Right.
second wave of transfers that come out of spring practice and decide, I'm not going to have a role that I want to move on. But like to your point about numbers, you can't have a very effective spring practice if you can't
Right. I mean, that's the thing.
You need bodies to have good practice.
Yeah.
So I mean,
be able to run at least 2 deep at these positions to get what you need out of spring. I mean, like you said, there will be attrition after the spring because there are going to be players that don't fit what they want, players that don't necessarily love this coaching staff, that decide after, that give it a shot. So I mean, obviously, there's going to be more as we go roster turnover, but at some point they need to get over 75 scholarship players somehow, some way.
I'm also fascinated by I don't know if fascinated is the right word. Just where the quarterback position is at the moment. So they've got now 3 guys or 4 guaranteed, presuming no one leaves, to be on roster for next season. Again, I think you can see the value of taking a really experienced quarterback, because before he committed, your room next year was redshirt sophomore, redshirt freshman, true freshman. They seem still to be in a really good position with Tyler Cherry from Center Grove. And it doesn't seem like taking Alberto Mendoza necessarily would dissuade them from also taking Cherry. But I mean, would they carry 5 quarterbacks? That's even in the 85 scholarship day, that's quite a bit. But
there's
on
not
the other
enough
hand,
reps to go around. Usually 4, you don't even get reps. It's the 3 guys really. So 5 seems.
But then in the same breath, I'm somebody who's covered a season where Indiana ended with 3 scholarship quarterbacks, all too injured to play. Yeah. So maybe 5 isn't a terrible number. And there's also always an extent to which kind of, quarterbacks and starting pitchers sort of feel the same way. You just kind of take them and work with them and hope that, the quantity of the load you take on, one emerges as a really good player. But I am kind of fascinated just by the way that they've attacked that position, both in recruiting and high school recruiting and in the portal, to give themselves a lot more options than it felt like Indiana had last year.
Yeah, but I mean, who are they throwing it to? I mean, skill position wise, I mean, the cupboard's bare right now, so it sort of goes hand in hand. Like, you only can get so fans can only get so excited about adding Rourke when you got 6 receivers right now. EJ Williams, I guess, is coming back. But the without McCulley, that room is really, really hurting. I think you've seen probably double-digit offers, I think, to Power 5 receivers or FBS receivers have gone out, transfer receivers from this new staff. So, I mean, I think they know that right now, too.
They
Running
seem to
back,
be targeting slot guys in
a lot
particular.
of slot and guys with return experience, because, I mean, obviously, you're, if you lose Jalen Lucas, and they also need to know that, I think, you got Josh Henderson, Justin Ellison, and it is kind of experienced guys, but to me, a running back never gets better 6 years into college. I really do think they could use somebody.
It's just funny we're still talking about
guys.
60-year player.
It's kind of to the point where it's like, look, if you run for 500 yards for 6 years in college at the Power 5 level, probably who you are. It's like I just think there's not a lot of upside to that running back room. I mean, we haven't seen anything of Holloman really, but Trent Holland was a guy that, to me, was kind of going up. You could see the arc where he was kind of, hadn't played at all, and you could see an upside. To me, that right now, that running back, the skill positions, which I thought was the strength kind of going in before all the guys into the transfer portal, now is, again, really, the cupboard's pretty bare.
To be fair, if you gave Indiana a 500-yard rushing running back last year, he would have led the team in rushing. So, I'm not sure I would totally knock that. Have you noticed? If I'm not mistaken,
I don't know who that speaks worse of.
Yeah, I know. I get it. I get what you're saying. Did you notice? I believe he did that. Trent Holland deleted his tweet about committing to Minnesota.
No, I didn't.
I think he did. Now his listen. I get it.
Reading Twitter is the worst.
I know.
You're
playing
into the worst instincts of fans. He changed his bio.
Well, his photo is still his commitment photo from Minnesota, but he deleted the tweet. So hey,
he liked how they captured his good side. They got the photo. That's all he wanted.
I'm just saying. There's obviously
nothing until the dotted. I mean, that is the point, right? Until something's signed on a dotted line, or even when it's signed on the dotted line, you just go to court now. But I mean, anything can change, really, I guess.
The other thing I would say about that wide receiver room, and again, it feels like the sort of optimism pessimism meter with McCulley has almost like stabilized, where it was like all the way up here, and at one point it was all the way up here at one point, and it feels like it's kind of come back to here with the idea of him staying. The one thing I would say about that receiver room is it is pretty. I mean, like without McCulley, there's a lot of I don't know how this works, but with McCulley, a lot of those pieces slide more comfortably into other places.
Well, yeah, because EJ Williams is a nice complementary number 2 receiver, right, with the upside. He could be a number 1, but right now, I mean, he hasn't been able to stay healthy the last couple of years. But I think he looks a lot more attractive. Number 2, Omar Cooper looks a lot more attractive at that 3rd spot. Everybody kind of shifts down, and I think it looks a lot better, for sure. Absolutely. But yeah, I mean, McCulley also was playing at a level where, I mean, he was like first team All Big Ten the last 6 games of the season. I mean, by far.
I don't remember his exact numbers, but if you look at it, I think it was his last 5 games. If you average those out over a 12-game run, and I recognize that that's imperfect math, because I think the only team of serious note that he played in those last 5 games might have been Penn State, or maybe 6 games or whatever. The point is, if you take that window at the end of the season when he, the thing with McCulley was we heard so much for like a year and a half about he moved from quarterback to wide receiver. He's gonna be really good once he figures out not just how to play receiver, but where his own ceiling is. He's gonna hit. He's gonna be off and running. And it felt like he finally kind of ascended to that level in the back half of last season, where he understood oh, this is how good I am. This is what I can do. This is how people basically can't stop me. And if you take those numbers from, again, I think it's the last 5 games, and I don't have them right in front of me, but I did this for something I wrote about the portal and everything, a week or two ago. If you average those out of over a 12-game run, he would have been top 3 in the Big Ten in catches, yards, and touchdowns all last season. And again, I recognize that's imperfect math, but it did feel like he went up a level, and it's not by accident that like Texas A&M, Penn State, Michigan have all offered. It seems like there's some other schools in the South, whether it's SEC or ACC, floating around him. I think Notre Dame, there's been rumors anyway, and I don't want to go too deep into entertaining rumors, but there's been some suggestions that Notre Dame has kind of gotten involved at some level. And you watch those games and you can kind of understand why. But I mean, I do think the complexion, I mean, listen, you need bodies one way or the other. Like, you need quality depth no matter what. But if Indiana were able to convince McCulley to come back, I do think between that and going and getting a quarterback, admittedly at a group of 5 level, with some real bona fide, sort of credentials, would probably change the complexion of Indiana's offseason pretty substantially, because suddenly you've got at least one side of the ball where you can say, I know, they need some offensive linemen, but you can say, I know what that looks like. Like, it's this guy at quarterback, it's these guys at receiver. You can start to watch some of the film of Cignetti's last couple of years at JMU and say, this makes sense for these players, but you got to do it.
Well,
You've got to get those guys in the fold.
Well, and McCulley was your best player last year, and he'd be your best player again this year. So, I mean, that's good. And then you think about it, that's 2 essentially, Carter Smith, an argument can be made. He would have been the second most important person to get back out of all the people that entered the portal. So if you land McCulley and Smith, that's your 2 top players that enter the portal that you get back. So even going 2 of 25, that's still not bad, because you're getting the 2 best players with, a 2, left tackle obviously is a hugely important position. I think that would be very significant to this team sort of, trying to claw to get to that 6-win mark. If that's your kind of benchmark, I think you lose McCulley. Offensively, you're looking for any sort of piece that you can get to try to, you need some. I think if you're losing McCulley, you need somebody with some experience in there to step into that wide receiver room.
Anything else you want to talk about football wise? Because we really should spend some time on IU, on basketball, and IU Kansas and all that. I don't want to say it's fun stuff for Indiana fans after last weekend, but it could be. We don't know yet.
No, we could go to basketball.
You don't want to talk about any more portal fun? You don't want to talk about how players might be eligible for the next 14 days, but then they might not be ever.
Yeah, well, but that's not as bad as basketball, because basketball players have just like jumped on the court, and now that might, like, their one game might be it.
Yeah, no, that's and as you said, all you gotta do is just sue, and now that is a whole separate podcast. Indiana, Kansas, 12:30 Saturday at Assembly Hall, games on CBS. I am actually genuinely fascinated about kind of where Indiana is in this game. They've, in the micro, they've had some rocky moments in this non-conference. In the macro, they've done everything, just fundamentally they needed to do to basically not let the non-conference sink them. And if we assume, and maybe this is a dangerous assumption, but if we assume that they take care of those 3 games around Christmas, at worst, they will come out of the non-conference having sort of gone through some growing pains that we expected them to, not absorb any awful blows, and in the process started 2-0 in the Big Ten. On the other hand, if they don't beat Kansas, even if they do clear out Morehead State, North Alabama, and Kennesaw State without much trouble, they will get really nothing out of the non-conference too for a team. And I don't, I have a hard and fast rule about like looking at bracket projections before Valentine's Day, but I don't think it's unfair to kind of talk about your net rating is down. You need some quality wins. There's probably not going to be as many opportunities for them in the Big Ten as there normally would be. Although if you look at their schedule, we might be overstating that a little bit. Like, only one of their first 9 opponents, or maybe it's 8. It's one of their first 9 opponents after the turn of the year. No, it's 8 opponents. Forgive me. But one of their first 8 opponents after the turn of the year is outside the KenPom top 75. So, like, there's going to be quantity there, but maybe not quality. And it's not just that Indiana has kind of fallen short when it's faced the best teams on its schedule. It's that Indiana has just looked non-competitive. And that's why I think this game, because you're going to have Assembly Hall behind you, because you've already sort of answered the question of like, can you win on the road? It wasn't a hugely impressive win, but you went on the road to Michigan. You won that. Like, you've already kind of started down the road of doing enough there. I think this team just needs to beat the sort of team that tells itself and college basketball more broadly, we're not just going to fall on our face every time we face a genuinely good basketball team.
But is that more? I mean, but that when you're talking about moral victories, right? Like, so it's like it's hard. It's like I think that's what fans want. But do you think like, I mean, like you said, ultimately, if they what will the record be if they lose it? So three other ones. So it's 10 and been 10-3 in the non-conference.
It would be 9-3 in the non-conference. Is that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
two of those
6,
because of
7.
the Big
It would
Ten.
be
Yeah,
8-3 in the
8-3
non-conference.
with
10-3 overall because of the two Big Ten.
I mean, that's really what you thought this team would be. And I mean, they were competitive for a half against UConn. So I mean, like, I don't know what more can you expect, especially with Xavier Johnson, who sounds like he won't play unless there's some sort of surprise. Unless, Mike Woodson was keeping his cards very close to the vest. I just think it's gonna be hard. Because this team's not there yet. In terms of being at that level.
I mean, I agree with that to a point, and like, I guess it's the question of basically where you think this team can go versus where this team wants to go, which is the NCAA tournament, obviously. And if you there's
But do you think it matters? Like, if they get blown out, like, do you think
I think they have to avoid getting blown out, like it just like an Auburn on their home floor. And listen, I have a theory. I said this on the radio last night. They'll never admit it. I think they were sick.
Yeah.
Like I don't think they win the game if they're all healthy, but just like they look, I went back and watched some of the film. Like, they look genuinely just lethargic. Like, for a team that hadn't played a game in 5 days, had plenty of build up. It's not like Atlanta, they didn't fly to Hawaii or something. Like, Atlanta's a 1 hour flight from Bloomington. Um, and then there was that whole, like, CJ Gunn was questionable. It turned out he was sick on Tuesday. Then suddenly, like, the entire starting five is questionable on Saturday. They just looked slow. And that doesn't absolve a 28-point loss, but maybe it's at least the difference between being more competitive, a la the way you were with Connecticut, as opposed to just sort of like just not having the fight back, essentially. And you would hope, if you're Indiana, that everybody's kind of run that through, that if that is the case, that's sort of run its cycle and it's out of the roster now. I just don't think you can afford a game at home where you just get absolutely embarrassed. If you lose close,
When was their last? I mean, have they had that during the Woodson era at home?
At home, they had a couple that, well, so they got manhandled by Iowa at home late last season, and it was just a game where Iowa hit 13 threes, and just like Indiana could not slow them down to save their lives. Like, Indiana just could not ever, and it was right after the Purdue game. They went up to Purdue and like they just kind of ran Purdue
yeah.
up there, and they came back and Iowa just started hitting threes and Indiana couldn't keep up. And then they had a couple games like that in Woodson's first season. Michigan did something similar to them in Assembly Hall. Illinois beat them 74-57. That game was a little bit more in the balance, kind of going into the second half before Illinois pulled away. But the two big ones are probably Michigan in Woodson's first season and Iowa last season. But even then, I would argue it's a little bit different because, like, in the context of a conference schedule, when you're only playing good teams and you're going on the road some, and there's some highs and some lows, every once in a while you're just going to have a burn the tape game. And like,
well, you're not getting a week off. I mean, this is coming a week off.
And also, none of those games would have had the buildup of a Kansas. In fact, both of those games happened after Indiana beat Purdue. The Michigan game was the Sunday after Indiana beat Purdue on the Rob Finney, almost all but buzzer beater on I think it was the Thursday. And then Iowa was the Tuesday after they beat Purdue up there. And listen, you got to learn how to handle momentum and all that stuff. I totally agree with that. But there were, within the context of the grind of a conference schedule, you could understand sort of why Indiana might not have some of the same sort of fire or whatever after that. And also, neither of those games ever got the billing of it's Kansas. It's at Assembly Hall. We announced this series like 3 years ago or 2 years ago or whatever. Last year, all of 15% of the crowd at Fog Island last year was Indiana fans, and Indiana fell in its face. You can't do that at home in a game like this. Assembly Hall will help you win this game. Trust me, I don't know how many games you'd attended Assembly Hall before this season. If Indiana's in this game in the last 5-8 minutes, that place is going to be on fire. And Assembly Hall is one of those places, like Fog Island, like Cameron, like the Breslin, that can basically be good for 7 to 10 points on its own. But you just can't afford to just get absolutely sort of buried into the floor in a game like this, I don't.
Well, I think we got to talk about, since he was talking, I assume Mike Woodson was talking to you directly about their 3-point shots. He said they take enough. Do they take enough? Do you agree?
Here's the one thing I would say about do they take enough. They're not a good shooting team. And he's never going to say that. He's never going to say, like, gentlemen. He loves to say gentlemen. I appreciate that he treats us with that term of respect.
This was guys. This was the less formal. So you
no,
can tell
that's true. That's true.
It was not
he was getting real with us. He was talking. It was straight talk.
Hey, you jerks.
it was straight talk. No, the one thing I would say is a coach is never going to come out and be like, listen, fellas, like, we just can't shoot it very well, so I don't want to take 27 a game.
But I mean, I think that
but they're not a good 3-point shooting team.
That's what he's
saying. So in his mind,
right,
he might, and I don't know that I completely agree with this, but I would understand this train of thought. In his own sort of mind as a coach, he might think, like, I need to see them hit at greater volume before I start saying, hey, fellas, let's shoot. I don't think that a team, like Indiana right now, so obviously we've talked about this, they are 359th out of 362 teams in Division One in the percentage of field goal attempts that are threes. They are 361st out of 362 teams in the percentage of points scored off threes, while they are 7th in the percentage of points scored off twos. But they're also 335th in 3-point shooting accuracy. Like, if the season ended today, this would be far and away the worst 3-point shooting team in Indiana history. So I guess my point here is there might be a part of Woodson that basically says, I've got 2 all Big Ten post players. And actually quietly, like, Mackenzie Mbako's starting to come around at the 3. Anthony Walker, I don't think people appreciate. I did not expect him to be essentially Indiana's best bench scoring option. I think in Woodson's mind, like, there's a bit of an argument of, like, why would we take shots that statistically right now we are not making with any regularity? Why would we take more of them at the expense of beating the good players?
Yeah. And I think that makes sense. But I think the question becomes, and it's not easy to ask this because he's never A, going to give a true answer, and B, admit, failure, essentially, that he did not do a very good job constructing the roster in terms of finding enough shooters. And that's sort of essentially where he's just stuck. They're stuck, right? Like, this is what this season is. And I think what he's saying, he's been asked a lot about, like, are you going to start making threes? And it's like, well, yeah, I'd love to start making threes. But this is what the team is, right? Like, I mean, this is what they got.
As a coach, you're not going to come out and be like, all my shooters are terrible. Like, you just like.
Well,
like
I mean,
fans want that
like that's the next
because they want, like, some sort of, like, brief, like immediate cathartic release to be like, yes, he finally admitted that they're all.
But I think that's the next step, right? He seems to be getting very frustrated with the questions, and maybe if you just keep asking, eventually he's gonna be like, look, guys, I don't know what you want me to tell you. Like, they can't, they're not gonna hit them. They're bad shooters.
The good news is, while Kansas statistically is a good shooting team, they don't take many of them. They are 320th in basically 3-point attempts as a percentage of overall field goal attempts nationally. They are 284th in points, in percentage of points scored off threes. They do have some good shooters. Kevin McCullough shoots 40.6%.
You've mentioned you've covered some bad shooting teams here in Indiana. Are they all near the bottom, like, all time? Or is this like by far and away the worst all time?
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, the bad shooting teams I've covered in Indiana, again, kept shooting threes. So, like,
this would be unique in the fact that they don't even shoot. They're not even bothering to shoot.
Right. So, like, I'm trying to find what would have been Archie's worst 3-point shooting team. Archie's worst 3-point shooting team was his 2019 team, which shot 31.2% collectively from behind the 3-point line. Right now, Indiana's obviously shooting a lower percentage collectively, but that team, that Archie team, almost 10% more of its field goals were threes than right now for Indiana. And it was scoring about 11.5% more of its points off threes than this one is. Now, there's some other things. Number one, that team was very guard driven. Romeo Langford obviously had Juwan Morgan, but Romeo Langford, Devontae Green, Rob Finney, Al Durham, that team was more guard driven. This team also just has two really, really good post players that quietly really complement each other. A lot of times when teams play two forwards or like a true forward center in modern basketball, it can be difficult because they kind of want to be in the same spots on the floor, but these two don't. One's right-handed, one's left-handed. One wants to drive, like wants to get the ball on the baseline and basically operate on footwork. The other one is just kind of like, meet me at the rim. I'm bigger than you. I'm longer than you. I can shoot over you if I need to. I'll go shoot some threes. It's not ideal that he's probably Indiana's best three-point shooter right now, but like, the point is, those teams also didn't have kind of this like this really defined like depth of post scoring that they could say, you know, we can lean on that instead of shooting threes.
I got you. Yeah.
And this Kansas team, there are guys that can hit them, but I think I want to say they're averaging like 6.5 makes a game. They don't shoot a ton, and you can kind of now. I think you got to be careful with like a Nicholas Timberlake kind of getting loose against you in a game like this, but you don't. It's not last year when they went up there and it was like, oh, here's Kevin McCullough and here's Grady Dick and here's Jalen Wilson, and there's just like too many guys that can expand the floor on you to cover, especially once Xavier Johnson broke his foot. This in that way, this team is not a horrible matchup. The flip side is you've got a lot more sort of proven overall scoring. You're not going to be able to out athlete them. You may know what Hunter Dickinson is, but he's still one of the best players in the country. So knowing what he is doesn't mean you're automatically going to beat him. It's going to be a difficult game for Indiana, and I think that one of the few things that may favor them in this matchup, as long as they can defend the 3-point line better than they did against Auburn, Lord knows, is you've got a team that may not necessarily be comfortable shooting like a huge volume of threes. Like this year, Kansas has attempted 20 or more threes 3 times. So they're not quite as bad as Indiana in terms of the accuracy or whatever. But they don't shoot them a lot. And only twice since November 20th, which was the game they opened with Chaminade in Maui, only twice have they shot above 35.3%. One game against UConn, they went 9 of 14. And then against UMKC, they were 8 of 20, which is 40%. But like they aren't nearly as exaggerated as Indiana with the 3-point shooting stuff, but they're not that far off.
A better matchup, but we only have less than a minute, so you gotta hit the wrap button, man.
Where is it? Where's the wrap button? Yeah, sorry, I kind of lost myself in that 3-point stuff. Anyway, Indiana, Kansas, 12:30
about good times.
Portal, all day, every day. There's no schedule in the portal; they just go on forever. Mike Niziolek, Bloomington General Times, Zach Osterman, Indianapolis Star. This has been Mind Your Banners for December 15th, 2023. Sorry this took so long to put together, but I promise you we will podcast more around Christmas. Maybe I'll even just start a podcast and you can listen to my kids open their presents. We'll talk to you soon.